All right, so we've got this mountain of articles all about critical race theory, and it seems like everywhere you turn, CRT is causing a stir. But sometimes it's hard to tell what's real and what's not, you know?
Yeah,
We're going to dig into the most interesting points from all the stuff you sent and see if we can figure out what CRT is really all about.
it's true. CRT has kind of become a hot topic. There's just so much information and misinformation out there that it's tough to even know where to start.
Right. Like one of the biggest things we keep hearing is that CRT is being taught in elementary schools and that it's
What?
basically turning kids against America. Is there any truth to that, though?
Well, CRT is mainly like a framework that academics use in colleges and universities
Hmm.
to look at how racism is built into laws and policies. It's not really a curriculum that's made for young children.
That makes sense. But I think what makes people so scared is this idea that CRT is calling all white people racist.
Hmm.
It's easy to see why that would make people defensive.
Oh,
Oh, yeah.
absolutely. And it's a misconception that's been used to purposely twist what CRT is really about. The focus isn't on making individuals feel guilty or blaming them. It's more about looking at how systems and institutions can keep inequality going, even if the people in those systems don't like have super obviously racist views.
Okay, so it's not about calling everyone racist, but more about looking at the bigger picture of how those policies and things that happened in the past can still have an impact today. But then there's that argument that just talking about race causes division. What do your sources say about that?
It's a pretty common reaction, but people who support CRT argue that having open and honest conversations about race is actually super important for getting rid of systemic racism. If we just ignore these problems, they don't go away. They just kind of fester under the surface.
I see how having these hard conversations can actually be a way to move forward instead of just causing more trouble, but I'm still wondering, why are some people so afraid of CRT? Is there something deeper going on?
That's a good question. And the stuff you sent actually has some ideas from psychology about that. One is this thing called meritocratic threat. It's
Mm.
like this belief that we all have that success comes from working hard and being talented. But CRT kind of challenges that by pointing out that things like whether you could afford a good education or if your family had money for generations also play a big role.
So if someone believes that they earned everything they have through hard work, it could be really upsetting to have that belief challenged, almost like it takes away from their accomplishments.
Exactly. And that uncomfortable feeling can make people get defensive. We also see this in the idea of group status threat, where if the power dynamics in society seem to be changing, it can make people anxious and resistant.
So for someone who sees all this talk about racial equity as a threat to their own group's position, CRT could feel like an attack on who they are, even if that's not what people are trying to do.
That's a really good way of putting it. And that fear can get even worse because of what's called zero-sum thinking. This idea that when one group gains something, another group automatically loses something.
Now I'm starting to understand how all these psychology things can contribute to why there are such heated debates around CRT. But now I'm even more curious about what CRT actually says about all this. It's clearly not just about making people feel guilty. There's some deeper analysis happening here.
Oh, for sure. And that's what we'll dig into next.
Yeah.
We've touched on some of the misunderstandings around CRT and the psychology of why people might react negatively to it. But to really get it, we have to unpack the core principles, starting with the concept of systemic racism. It's interesting how this idea of systemic racism can be so hard for some people to get. We tend to think of racism as just, individual acts of prejudice. But CRT wants us to look beyond those individual actions and see the bigger patterns that are happening.
I'm starting to get that. Like, even if everyone had good intentions, there could still be systems in place that put certain groups at a disadvantage. It's like having rules for a game that seem fair on the surface, but actually they help some players and hurt others.
That's a great way to put it. And one of these articles you gave me had a really powerful example of this with redlining. Even though those policies were outlawed a long time ago, they're still affecting housing patterns and wealth gaps today.
So those past injustices are kind of like ripples in a pond. Their impact keeps spreading out over time. It makes you realize that history isn't just something we read about in books. It's woven into the very fabric of our society.
Exactly. And CRT helps us see how those things from the past are still shaping the present. But it's not just about race, right? There's also this idea of intersectionality, which I'll admit I'm still trying to wrap my head around.
I hear you. It can sound a little jargony at first, but from what I understand, it's about realizing that people's experiences are shaped by all these different identities they have.
That's a good way to explain it. It's about understanding that someone's experience with racism might be totally different depending on if they're a man or a woman. or their social class, or sexual orientation, or if they have a disability, adds like these extra layers to the conversation.
One of the sources you sent had this really powerful story about a Black woman who felt like her doctor wasn't listening to her when she was having symptoms of a serious illness. She felt like they weren't taking her seriously because she was Black and because she was a woman. It made me realize how these different kinds of oppression can all come together and create these unique challenges for people.
That's a really sad example. And it shows why it's so important to not just have these oversimplified explanations for inequality.
Mm.
Intersectionality makes us acknowledge everyone's individual experiences and see that oppression can show up in all these different ways.
Okay, so we've talked about systemic racism and intersectionality and how it's important to understand how things in the past still affect us today. But I'm also curious about how CRT is being used in action. Is it just a theory or is it actually helping to make real changes in the world?
That's a great question. And actually, your sources had some really good examples of how CRT is being used in different areas to challenge the usual ways of thinking and promote social justice.
This is where it gets really interesting to me because it's one thing to understand these ideas in a general sense, but it's another to actually see how they're being used to make a real difference.
Totally. And one of the main places where we see CRT having an influence is in education. It's being used to look at everything from what's being taught in schools to discipline practices and even how schools get their funding.
You know, one of the articles you sent talked about how the way we fund schools can actually keep inequality going. Because a lot of times schools get money based on property taxes. And historically, communities of color haven't had the same opportunities to build wealth through owning homes. So their schools end up with less money.
That's exactly the kind of insight that CRT brings. It helps us see how policies that seem neutral can actually have different effects on different racial groups, even if that wasn't the intention.
So it's about looking deeper and asking, who is this system helping and who is it leaving behind?
Exactly. And CRT encourages us to move beyond just trying to be equal, which is often about treating everyone the same, and instead focus on equity, which is about realizing that different groups might need different kinds of support to have the same opportunities.
It's like that saying, equality is giving everyone the same shoes, but equity is giving everyone the shoes that fit.
Perfect analogy. And this focus on equity isn't just in education. We also see it in the legal field, where CRT is being used to look at things like racial bias in sentencing, or the death penalty, and the way laws are written and enforced.
It's about making sure our justice system actually lives up to that idea of equal justice under law, not just in theory, but in reality.
Right, because as your sources point out, even when laws seem to be colorblind on the surface, they can be used in ways that disproportionately hurt communities of color.
It's about looking beyond just the words of the law and seeing if the spirit of the law is really being followed. Are there other areas where CRT is being used like this?
Absolutely. We also see it in healthcare, where CRT helps us understand how things in the system contribute to the racial disparities we see in health outcomes.
Healthcare seems like one area where those disparities are really obvious.
It's about recognizing that those disparities aren't just random. They're often the result of things like implicit bias from doctors and nurses, or unequal access to good quality care. And the fact that historically there's been medical experimentation on Black people.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. But it's so important to acknowledge these things if we really want to create a healthcare system that's fair for everyone.
That's the power of CRT. It's not just about identifying the problem. It's about giving us a way to understand how we got here and what we can do to make real change.
So it's like we found the virus and now we can start working on a cure.
Exactly. And CRT is being used in all sorts of areas like housing policy, environmental justice, and even diversity initiatives in companies. It's a lens that we can use in pretty much any area where there are racial disparities. It helps us understand the root causes and come up with better solutions.
It's like shining a light on those hidden places where inequality is happening and saying, we see you and we're not going to let you hide anymore.
Exactly. It's about moving past those surface-level solutions, the Band-Aids that don't really get at the root of the problem. It's about taking apart those systems of oppression piece by piece until we create a world where everyone has a fair chance to succeed.
That's a big goal. But I have to say, learning about CRT and how it's being used has given me some hope. Like, okay, this is going to be hard, but at least we have a map to follow.
And that map starts with understanding. Understanding the problem, understanding where it comes from, understanding how power and privilege work in our society.
It's like we can't fix something if we don't even realize it's broken. And CRT helps us to see things clearly, to connect the dots and understand how we got here and where we need to go.
Exactly. And it's that understanding that will eventually lead to action, to change, to progress.
Hmm.
But hold on a second.
I was just thinking that we've covered a lot,
Yeah.
from debunking those myths to really getting into the main ideas of CRT and how it's being used. My brain is buzzing with all this new information.
It is a lot to process. But remember, this is just the beginning. The goal isn't to make you a CRT expert. It's to make you curious and give you the knowledge to be a part of these really important conversations.
And hopefully to have those conversations in a way that's more thoughtful and understanding. Because let's face it, these are tough conversations to have. But they're absolutely necessary if we want to create a world that's more just and fair.
I couldn't agree more. But before we wrap up, there's one more really important piece of CRT that we need to talk about. And it might be the most important one.
This is about to get even deeper. Tell me more.
Well, all the sources you gave me say that really understanding CRT isn't just about taking in information. It's about thinking about how these ideas connect to our own experiences and what we believe.
Ooh, I like where this is going. So it's not just a mental exercise. It's about actually applying these ideas to our own lives.
Exactly. It's about asking ourselves some hard questions, like, have I ever benefited from privilege without even realizing it? Or have I ever made assumptions about someone because of their race, even unconsciously?
Wow, that's getting pretty personal. But I see how it's important to really understanding what CRT is all about.
It's about going beyond just the ideas and talking about personal responsibility, which can be uncomfortable, even painful sometimes.
No one likes to admit that they might be part of the problem. But what we've been reading suggests that this discomfort actually means we're growing, that we're getting closer to a more honest and nuanced understanding of race and inequality.
Exactly. It's about admitting that we all have blind spots and we all have work to do. And that work starts with being self-aware and being willing to look at our own beliefs and actions critically.
It's like we can't change the system if we're not willing to change ourselves.
Right. That's a really profound statement. And this process of self-reflection is something we have to keep doing. It's not a one-time thing. It's about always questioning what we think, challenging our biases, and trying to be more aware of how our actions affect other people.
It's a journey, not a destination. And I have to say, I feel more prepared for that journey now thanks to all this.
That's what we're here for, to give you the knowledge and tools to navigate all of this. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are tons of resources, organizations, and people who are committed to racial justice, who can support you and guide you along the way.
It's about building a community, learning from each other, and working together to create a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued.
Beautifully said. Now, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought. If CRT is about understanding how all these systemic things contribute to racial inequality, what can we actually do, both individually and together, to dismantle those systems and create a society that truly values justice and equity?
Ooh, that's a big question. And a perfect one to think about as we continue on our own journeys of self-reflection and learning.
Exactly. It's a question that each of us needs to wrestle with as we keep learning and examining our own roles, and thinking about how we can help to take apart these systems of oppression. It's not easy work, but it's absolutely essential.
Well said. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into critical race theory. We hope it's made you curious, challenged what you thought you knew, and inspired you to keep learning and growing. Remember, this is just the start of the conversation. Let's keep exploring these complex issues together with open hearts and minds as we work towards a world that's more just and equitable for everyone. So this last part is about self-reflection. What does that even mean when we're talking about something as big as critical race theory?
It's about taking everything we've been talking about,
Mm-hmm.
like those historical legacies, those systems that are so deep, and kind of turning the focus inwards, looking at our own lives, our own beliefs, and asking ourselves some tough questions.
So it's not just about pointing fingers at other people, it's about looking at ourselves. That sounds a little scary, to be honest.
It can be. But the articles you sent really emphasize that feeling uncomfortable is actually like a key part of this whole thing. I mean, we're not just understanding CRT in our heads. We're starting to really grapple with what it means for us personally.
One of the articles talked about it like an iceberg. We spent the first two parts looking at the tip of the iceberg, the racism that we can all see. But now we're going deeper under the surface to those beliefs and biases that we might not even realize we have. The ones that shape how we see things and what we do.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
And it shows why this self-reflection can be so hard. It makes us confront parts of ourselves in our society that we might not want to see.
Like those times when we might have benefited from privilege without even knowing it, or those times when we made judgments about someone based on their race, even if we didn't mean to. It makes you realize how much of this stuff happens without us even noticing.
Exactly. And it's in those little everyday moments that systemic racism often keeps going. So this isn't about feeling bad or blaming ourselves. It's about becoming aware of our own blind spots so we can start to change those patterns in our thinking and behavior.
So if we want to build a better world that's more just and equal, we have to start with ourselves. That feels like a huge responsibility.
It is a big responsibility, but
Yeah.
it's also really powerful. Because once we start to understand how these systems work, both inside of us and in the world around us, we can start to challenge them, disrupt them, and create real change.
We can't fix something if we don't even know how it works. Right, and that includes understanding where we fit in.
Exactly. And this journey of self-reflection is something we do throughout our lives. It's not just a one-time thing. It's about constantly questioning what we think, seeking out different perspectives, and challenging ourselves to be more understanding and caring.
I'm seeing now how CRT isn't just an academic theory. It's a call to action, a way to change both ourselves and the world around us.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, there are so many resources out there that can help you on this journey. Books, podcasts, organizations. They can provide support, guidance, and a sense of community.
It's realizing that we're all in this together. We all have a part to play in creating a more just and equitable world.
That's right. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one last thought. If CRT is about understanding how these big systems contribute to racial inequality, what can we actually do, both on our own and together, to dismantle those systems
Hmm.
and create a society that really values justice and equity?
That's a really powerful question. And I think it's one that we each need to think about as we continue learning and reflecting.
It is. It's a question that challenges us to really engage with what we've learned, to think about our own role, and consider how we can contribute to dismantling those systems of oppression. It's not easy work, but it's absolutely crucial.
Well said. Thanks to everyone for listening to this deep dive on critical race theory. We hope it's made you think, challenged your assumptions, and inspired you to keep learning and growing. Remember, this is just the beginning. Let's keep exploring these important issues together with open hearts and minds. As we work towards a world that's more just and fair for everyone,